Paul Orndorff was called Mr. Wonderful, but that's only because Mr. Punches You mid-sentence didn't fit on the promo poster. He was the kind of guy who could be halfway through complimenting your haircut and still clothesline you into the afterlife. Built like a Greek god who just discovered meth and creatine, Paul Orndorff looked like a man permanently one minor inconvenience away from a felony. Orndorff stood out as a man who didn't suffer fools. He pile-drove them. His handshake was a threat, his promos sounded like someone had handed a loaded gun to a gym rat, and he had the sort of temper usually reserved for Scottish dads fixing broken boilers. And here's the thing. Orndorff didn't play politics. He played fists. If he didn't like you, he wouldn't backstab you in the locker room. He'd just uppercut you into a neck brace, usually before you'd even finished tying your boots. He lived in that wonderful part of the wrestling Venn diagram where old school, short-tempered, and doesn't care about lawsuits all overlap. So today, let's pay tribute to the 5 poor bastards unlucky enough to live rent-free in Paul Orndorff's head. Not the kayfabe ones he pretended to hate, but the real-life enemies he'd have joyfully suplexed off a balcony. Buff Bagwell, the guy who thought flexing in front of a mirror would get him everywhere, and in many ways it did, for a while. Let's not beat around the bush here. Buff Bagwell had the body. He was the quintessential 90s wrestling heartthrob, with abs so defined they could cut glass, and a physique that looked like it was sculpted out of marble by a particularly vain Greek god. But if there's one thing Orndorff had little patience for, it was wrestlers who relied solely on their looks instead of their talent. While Orndorff had a solid, no-nonsense approach to wrestling, Bagwell seemed to be under the impression that his six-pack and pecs were enough to keep him at the top. To say that Orndorff wasn't impressed by this would be an understatement. Orndorff, the consummate professional, understood that being a great wrestler wasn't about having a perfect body. It was about being able to tell a compelling story in the ring. And Bagwell? He was more interested in posing for the cameras than in delivering quality matches. Orndorff was always about getting the crowd invested in the match, drawing them in with psychology and storytelling. Bagwell, on the other hand, seemed to think that just by showing up, flexing those muscles, and hitting a few basic moves, the fans would cheer for him. This approach didn't sit well with Orndorff, who took the art of wrestling much more seriously. Orndorff was all about respecting the craft, and to him, Bagwell's obsession with his appearance was the wrestling equivalent of a pop star's lip-syncing to a pre-recorded track. Shallow, fake, and ultimately disrespectful to the business. Bagwell's self-absorbed attitude didn't help matters either. Rumor has it that he'd spent hours in the gym, looking in mirrors, as if his biceps could talk their way into a title match. In the eyes of Orndorff, Bagwell was what you'd call a flash-in-the-pan wrestler. A guy who'd get by on his looks for a while, but when the fans got tired of seeing the same old routine, he'd be left in the dust, much like any trend from the 90s. Orndorff, who had been grinding in the business for years, knew the deal. You couldn't just rely on being a pretty face, you had to deliver. And let's face it, Bagwell wasn't delivering. Paul Roma, better known for his tag team run with Arn Anderson as part of the Four Horsemen in WCW, but much like a forgotten 80s sitcom character, the less said about him the better. Orndorff, the man who wrestled legends, saw Roma as the type of guy who was more interested in staying in the limelight than actually being good at wrestling. Orndorff wasn't wrong. Roma's character was basically a walking cautionary tale of how to get ahead in the business without actually knowing how to work a match. Now, let's be clear. Orndorff wasn't a guy to hold grudges for no reason. He didn't hate just anyone. But when it came to Roma, he saw the man as a prime example of what was wrong with the industry. Roma was more concerned with his spot on the card than the quality of his in-ring work. To Orndorff, Roma wasn't a professional wrestler. He was a gym rat in boots. The man had more veins than charisma and seemed to believe that doing bicep curls qualified as ring psychology. In the land of serious workers, Roma was the equivalent of karaoke night at a funeral. Orndorff, a legit tough guy from the school of Bob Backlund beatdowns and flare headlocks, saw Roma strutting around like a backup dancer from a low-budget disco video and thought, this is the end of the business. Their time together in WCW was a comedy of errors. Roma would turn up oiled to the gills, flexing at nothing in particular, as if he was trying to seduce the hard cam. Meanwhile, Orndorff was probably picturing 50 ways to slap the tan off him. In interviews, Orndorff rarely hid his contempt, calling Roma a bodybuilder trying to wrestle, and once saying Roma had the mind of a child and the ego of a god, which, ironically, is the perfect combination to get a podcast these days. There were whispers backstage that Orndorff once offered to tighten up Roma in the locker room, old school wrestler lingo for beat some bloody respect into you. Roma wisely declined. Their interactions were less friendly mentor and more school teacher trying not to punch the mouthy kid during detention. Orndorff, who'd bled and clawed for every ounce of credibility in wrestling, saw Roma as the human embodiment of coasting. All show, no go, and definitely no clue. In Orndorff's eyes, Roma's career wasn't a slow burn. It was a wet fart in a hurricane. Loud, embarrassing, and forgotten the second it happened. Chris Kanyon had a catchphrase that asked, "Who better than Kanyon?" To Paul Orndorff, the answer was, "Mate, the ring crew, the guy selling popcorn, and the raccoon rummaging through the dumpster behind the building." If Orndorff respected anyone in wrestling, it was the kind of person who put the craft first. Kanyon? He was like a DIY wrestler. All the tools, no bloody instructions. And now don't get it twisted. Kanyon was athletic, creative, and not without talent. But in Orndorff's eyes, he was also a man who wrestled like he was on mushrooms and trying to build a match out of IKEA instructions written in Braille. You could see the rage in Orndorff's face when Kanyon started doing springboards and spinning neckbreakers like a man auditioning for America's Got Concussions. The heat between them really cooked backstage at the WCW power plant, the kind of place where dreams went to die under a pile of protein powder and broken promises. Orndorff was a trainer there, trying to teach old-school discipline, while Kanyon was prancing about trying to invent new moves like he was Willy Sodding Wonka of wrestling. To a guy like Orndorff, who believed a match should be built slow, logical, and stiff enough to knock a filling loose, Kanyon might as well have been choreographing a school musical. There was an infamous day when Orndorff tore into Kanyon in front of half the locker room. Apparently, Kanyon had been taking too many liberties in the ring, Orndorff's term for "you wrestle like a twat." The story goes that Orndorff said something to the effect of, "If you ever try that flippy shit with me, I'll send your jaw to Memphis." Kanyon, credit where due, kept showing up. But to Orndorff, persistence wasn't a virtue if you kept doing everything wrong. It wasn't personal, it was principle. To Orndorff, Kanyon represented a generation of wrestlers raised on video games, thinking moves were more important than meaning. Flash over psychology, spots over storytelling. It was wrestling without the wrestling, like calling yourself a chef because you once heated a Pop-Tart. So, who better than Kanyon? According to Orndorff, absolutely everyone who knows which end of the ring to sell from. Thought Gary Hart looked like a bloke who managed a strip club and also wrote horoscopes under a fake name. As a wrestling manager, he had a cult following, mainly because people weren't sure if he was a brilliant promo guy or an escaped hypnotist from a prison carnival. But to Paul Orndorff, Gary Hart wasn't mysterious or underrated. He was an oily little goblin who tried to manipulate talent like he was running a low-stakes mafia. You've got to understand, Orndorff didn't just dislike Hart. He outright distrusted the man, the same way you'd eye someone wearing leather gloves in July. Hart wasn't a wrestler, he was a manager. And to Orndorff, that was like being a wedding DJ who thinks he's part of the band. Hart floated around Texas and the Southern Territories booking shows, whispering in ears and stirring up trouble like a backstage witch doctor. Orndorff saw through it instantly. The kind of bloke who makes you shake hands with your own enemy, then sells the handshake to the highest bidder. The beef came down to business and bullshit. Hart fancied himself as some sort of wrestling Machiavelli, booking finishes with a smirk and playing locker room politics like it was a full-time job. Orndorff, meanwhile, was trying to lace up his boots and do his job without some guy in snakeskin shoes trying to tell him how to work a match. According to one shoot interview, Orndorff said, Hart tried to talk like he was smarter than everyone in the room, but the only thing he was qualified to manage was a pawn shop and maybe an exorcism. Hart also had a reputation for talking behind people's backs, a wrestling sin worse than botching a suplex while calling yourself a veteran. Orndorff was a man who'd say it to your face, possibly while throwing a right hand. The two were oil and water. Actually, scratch that. They were oil and someone who sets oil on fire for fun. Gary Hart, with his vampire tan and dime store wisdom, represented everything Orndorff hated. Manipulation, politics, and empty talk dressed up as genius. In Orndorff's eyes, Hart didn't earn respect. He bartered for it. And Orndorff? He didn't barter. He just punched you in the mouth and let God sort out the booking. A big Van Vader, the only man who could make a moonsault look like a war crime. He was a beast, a brawler, and built like someone who'd been bitten by a radioactive fridge. But for all his mass and menace, Vader had one fatal flaw in Paul Orndorff's eyes. He had the attitude of a toddler in a rhino costume. Orndorff didn't just hate Vader's work style, he hated the man. And unlike most wrestling beefs that simmer behind passive-aggressive interviews, this one ended with one of the most legendary backstage maulings in history. Let's get this straight. Orndorff was no shrinking violet. The man walked like he was auditioning to play Anger in an inside-the-head Pixar reboot. But Vader? Vader was reckless, disrespectful, and carried himself like he was the final boss in a video game that no one wanted to play. Orndorff saw Vader as the embodiment of everything wrong with WCW in the 90s. Bloated paychecks, no accountability, and a head so big it needed its own locker. The infamous 1995 WCW backstage altercation between them is stuff of wrestling folklore. Vader, reportedly late for a promo shoot, got lippy with Orndorff, who was in flip-flops and still managed to beat Vader so badly he allegedly left his soul somewhere between the vending machine and the locker room door. That wasn't a fight. That was Paul Orndorff committing an exorcism in sandals. And here's the bit Orndorff really hated. Vader could dish it out in the ring, stiff as a butcher's bill, but couldn't take a receipt. The guy would potato you in the face, then whine like a bagpipe full of custard when you fired back. Orndorff, raised in the school of hard knocks, saw that as the ultimate cowardice. A man who hits hard but can't take a knockback without throwing a tantrum. He called Vader out for it, and Vader folded like a camping chair at a weight loss convention. Vader may have been a monster in Japan, a legend to some, but to Orndorff he was a bully with a short fuse and a glass jaw. And the day Orndorff clocked him with a bare fist while wearing shower slides? That was justice. Old school, shoot style. You disrespected me, now meet my knuckles, justice. In Orndorff's world, you didn't get respect by being feared. You earned it by being solid. Vader? He just happened to be large and loud, a walking gimmick with a heart full of excuses. Paul Orndorff didn't just dislike people, he diagnosed them. Like a grumpy GP of the squared circle, he could spot a fraud at 50 paces, and had the hands to write the prescription. One punch to the jaw, taken hourly until symptoms of delusion subside. The 5 men we've walked through here weren't just bad wrestlers in Orndorff's eyes. They were sins against the business, crimes in boots, performance art disasters held together with tanning oil and misplaced confidence. It wasn't about clashing styles. It was about violating the code. Orndorff grew up in a wrestling world where respect was the currency, and you earned it by bleeding, sweating, and not being a complete bollocks backstage. If you were a prima donna, a phony, a manipulator, then to Orndorff, you weren't a peer, you were a target. Paul Roma was a bodybuilder with a head full of air and the 4 Horsemen's credibility dribbling out of his boots. Kanyon was a brilliant chaos engine who wrestled like his controller had jammed. Buff Bagwell was the spiritual love child of a selfie stick and a lobotomy. Gary Hart looked like he sold fake Rolexes out of a trench coat and booked matches like he was doing tax fraud on the side. And Vader? Vader was a one-man demolition derby with the emotional maturity of a smoked ham. In Orndorff's world, these were not just annoyances. They were the harbingers of everything that went wrong with wrestling after the tape trading era died. But that's what makes Orndorff so fascinating. His hatred was pure. He didn't fake it for heat or clickbait. He wasn't working a gimmick. He was just Mr. Wonderful, an old-school bastard with morals. The kind of guy who'd suplex his own tag partner if they missed a cue, then light a cigar off the friction of the impact. In the end, Orndorff's career wasn't defined by championships or promos. It was defined by principle, by the sheer, unrelenting refusal to let the business be embarrassed by charlatans in shiny tights. And while most men leave behind a legacy, Orndorff left behind a list: 5 names, 5 receipts, and 1 final furious lesson. Respect the business, or Mr. Wonderful will make sure you don't remember your own postcode. Thanks for watching. Cheers for watching, you bunch of legends. If you liked what you saw, smash that like button like Orndorff smashed Vader in sandals. And hit subscribe, or Buff Bagwell gets another TV push. Don't say I didn't warn you.